We should get started. So welcome everybody to the next edition of the LOF&BE webinar series. I'm Sarah McAllister again. If you haven't already seen me before doing these, I'm hosting this with Sam Manzello and Sayaka Suzuki. Our speaker today is Amy Christianson. Just briefly about her, she is a Métis woman from the Cardinal Laboucan families of Treaty 8 territory. She's a fire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, where her research program focuses on Indigenous fire stewardship, wildfire evacuations, and wildfire mitigations. So just kind of procedure here, we'll, if everybody can remember to put themselves on mute, that'd be great. And then we'll do questions through the chat box when we're done. So with that, I'm gonna let Amy go after it. Thank you, Amy.
Sure, perfect. So thanks for having me today. And Sarah, just wave your hands if I start lagging or anything issues come up, and I can actually see you. So that's nice when I'm presenting. So yeah, today I was going to speak on celebrating Indigenous fire stewardship in Canada. And I think, first that I just wanted, like generally we start these with land acknowledgements, but it's quite awkward, doing land acknowledgements when we're virtual. But, I just really wanted to first acknowledge all the Indigenous people. And because this is an international talk, on every continent who, were burners, tried burning even when it was outlawed and, felt that responsibility to steward their environment. And so I just think often of my ancestors who, were up in northern Alberta in the boreal forest and used fire as a tool. So I guess we'll just get started. So I'm, as Sarah said, a fire research scientist now. I work for the Canadian Forest Service. And in my role there, I work mostly on Indigenous fire stewardship, so getting fire back to the land. And I also work on fire evacuations. And then risk mitigation too. So just to start with a quick definition, because it's not really the same for everyone, but in Canada, we refer to Indigenous peoples, and that's kind of just a generic pan-Indigenous name that we give them, but we actually have 3 Indigenous groups in Canada. So that's the First Nations, the Métis people, which I'm a part of, and then the Inuit. And so there's, and even in that group, in those groups, there's a lot of different nations. So in the First Nation groups, I think there's over 600 registered nations with the Canadian, the Canadian government recognizes there. So yeah, it's a very, very diverse group and lots of burners there. So when I'm speaking about Indigenous people, I'm kind of just chatting about all 3 groups, but any specific knowledge, I always try to attribute it to the appropriate nation. So just to give a bit of a background on wildfire risk in Canada to Indigenous nations, most of our First Nations population lives on reserves. So those are designated areas where they live and were established through treaty or other processes. And our other, it's quite complicated, but our other groups, Métis and Inuit, don't have reserves. So we'll just talk about First Nations reserve evacuees right now. So if we look at the sum of the total wildfire evacuees in Canada between 1980 and 2020, the blue lines are total evacuees. So as you can see, like for example, 2016, we had over 100,000 wildfire evacuees in Canada that summer. And then orange is the sum of the First Nation evacuees that same year. So you can see that as you look across that Indigenous people are really disproportionately represented in evacuations. First Nations people make up probably around 2.5% of the Canadian population, but they have often over 30% of the wildfire evacuations. And so there's been years where you can see really high impacts. So 1989, 2006, 2011 with the Slave Lake fire, 2015 where almost all the evacuees were from First Nations that year. And then 2019 where all of our evacuees were Indigenous or were First Nations that year. And I should note that what this doesn't include is urban First Nations people or Métis or Inuit. So if we were actually to calculate the number of Indigenous evacuees, it would be much, much higher. Like in 2016, most people know about the Fort McMurray fires. Well, Fort McMurray is actually where my family's from, and there's a really high proportion of Indigenous people that live there, but that live in the urban center. So the number of Indigenous evacuees is actually much higher. So there's also, this is just a GIF on the side. Hopefully you can see it, Sarah. That's just showing the Elephant Hill fire that happened in 2017, and just showing every image is one day. So it's just showing the explosive growth of that fire. And that was all that occurred through Indigenous territory there, and near a few different Indigenous nations, and had a massive impact on their territory. And so in Canada, 60% of First Nation reserves are located within or intersect the wildland-human interface. And that doesn't include First Nations that might be neighboring, or we also have a big problem in Canada with grass fires on our First Nation reserves. And First Nation reserves also have a really frequent fire return interval compared to non-reserve populations. And looking at like climate projections, we're seeing that those numbers are really going to increase substantially, looking at different climatic scenarios moving forward. So again, Indigenous people will continue in Canada to be impacted by fire. And there's a real vulnerability in Canada from colonial programs that were put into place on Indigenous peoples in Canada. So things like, putting people onto reserves. We have really overcrowded housing on those reserves. There's generally low income levels. There's a lot of young kids and a lot of seniors in those communities as well. So with Indigenous fire stewardship, I'm not sure. We're looking more at a relational worldview. And I think that that's the important thing to understand here, is that, we see everything as in relation to one another. And even, the plants, the trees, as Robin Wall Kimmerer says, like they all have stories or songs that they have. And so when we're using fire, we're using it to achieve certain cultural objectives on the landscape. So we view fire as a responsibility and fire as a medicine. So not only a medicine for the land, lots of times when you talk to an Indigenous person, like internationally, they might talk about, using fire to clean up the land. That's a really common theme, but it's not only about the land, it's also about like our health as people, the health of our culture, how we're able to carry out our cultural practices, because those are all reliant on the territory in which we live. And so there's a real lack of understanding, though, of cultural burning practices and what that, like where they happen, how you do them, when they occur, the techniques that you use, the risk that's involved. So for the type of burning that we do, it's a really low risk burning. It generally occurs in the spring or the fall. It has to occur within a certain interval of time, depending on what you're doing or why you're doing it. And in Northern Canada, lots of that depends on where the snow is. So, where the snow's melted, and it's a really, as well, low risk activity. So most Indigenous peoples in Canada who do cultural burns, they don't wear personal protective equipment. In this picture here, that's me burning on my property, and I'm 6 months pregnant in that picture. And, it's the smoke exposure and other things is just so low compared to, what California experienced this year, or Australia. And so I think I just wanted to show, that it's also a family activity most of the time. Like children come, elders come. You don't have to pass a fitness test to be able to do a cultural burn. So I guess I'll get into then this new booklet that we have out. So the booklet was produced in partnership with Fire Smart Canada, and it's called Blazing the Trail, Celebrating Indigenous Fire Stewardship. And so if you're not aware, in Canada, we have the Fire Smart program, and that's kind of loosely based on the FireWise program out of the US. And in that program, there's a lot of products that they have. So different home assessments you can do, different brochures, informational videos. But one of the biggest issues with that I've heard from Indigenous people with the fire smart materials is that they don't see themselves in them. They don't see people that look like them. They don't see communities that look like their community. There's really big issues in Canada around jurisdictional issues. So most First Nations people who live on reserve, they don't own their homes. So when you're telling them in a fire smart manual, to go and change out their windows or change their roof or do other things, well, they can't actually do that. So it really disconnects them from the fire smart or the risk reduction method. So we decided to, produce this booklet. It was a collaborative writing project. It involved all Indigenous people, which was actually pretty fun, I guess. It was 9 Indigenous fire knowledge holders who collaboratively wrote the book. So these are people from nations all across Canada. It was peer reviewed by 14 Indigenous fire stewardship scholars and practitioners. We included stories from 11 different Indigenous communities and artwork from 7 Indigenous artists. And the idea was to celebrate topics on Indigenous fire stewardship and leadership with important outcomes focused on wildfire prevention and risk reduction. So one of the biggest things with the fire steward, or with this booklet, is there's not really a checklist that you can give to an Indigenous person and say, here, do this, and now you'll reduce your fire risk. So what we were trying to show here is what different nations across Canada are doing where they're effectively reducing their risk, but through really unique and creative programs. So I just wanted, this wasn't me only that did this booklet. We had a really great writing team that I just wanted to show here everybody's names and their nations, where they're from, and where they work in the real world. So it was a really fun team to be a part of. And the funder, as I said before, was Fire Smart Canada and Agriculture, Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. We had Indigenous copy editors, graphic designers, illustrators, storytellers who appeared throughout the book. There was also a peer review team, as I said before. So these are their names there. And, they did a great job. We went through 3 different rounds of peer review on this, and I'll speak to the challenges at the end of the booklet of including what everyone wanted to see. So this is just one of the pieces of art for the booklet, and so this is Andrew Dexel's work, and in the booklet there's descriptions beside each of the pieces of artwork. So what we had done was a competition, basically to just say to Indigenous people, like, what does fire mean to you? And they were allowed to submit, and we didn't really pick winners. What we wanted to do was be really representative. So we picked people from all different age groups and from all across Canada. And each artist who was selected received a $3,000 commission for their work to be featured in the book. So the book begins with a foreword from Harry Spahan and Joe Gilchrist, and they're both fire keepers from the interior of British Columbia, so near Merritt, British Columbia, for anyone familiar with BC. And so they wrote a book forward that's really great and just talks about, as I mentioned before, the importance of Indigenous relationship to the land and their responsibility there. So this is a great picture of them with a bear in one of the communities. And so I just wanted to give to show you kind of what the book looks like. So we don't necessarily talk specifically about, fire or risk reduction methods. It's all about, fire from an Indigenous worldview. So one is, using fire as medicine and using fire in healing ceremonies. So of course, these are different throughout Canada, the types of ceremonies that are used depending on nations, but we're trying here to speak to the importance of fire in all aspects of life. So one of the most important things is in many Indigenous cultures is their fire creation story. So we were lucky enough here with Nicolalwa who's from Upper Nicola Band, and he shared with us how Coyote brought fire to the people. So their story there of how fire became used in their community. And then we were also lucky enough to have Shalyn Jowdry, who's from a Mi'kmaq woman from Nova Scotia. And she gave us a story too of fire and how fire is used in the community and the importance of fire to family too. So that's a great picture of her there. And that's healing through storytelling. So using words and oral history to, share about fire and how to heal the land. So I was just I know I advertised this as kind of a walkthrough of the booklet. So I just wanted to mention here all the stories that are included because of, well, basically the contributions of the people who submitted them. So story 1, it goes into detail about historic fire use in Northern Alberta. So Henry Lewis was a researcher who went up and he worked with the Dene and the Woodland Cree people, looking at how and why they used fire in their communities back in the 1970s. So this goes into detail about, what he found then. And I think for me, one of his saddest findings was that he felt like in 1970s when he was up there, that due to like colonial fire management practices, about 95% of the fire knowledge there had been lost in the community on how to put fire back on the territory. And so that means, now 50 years later, it's hard to know how much of that, historic knowledge. And for me, it's just it's sad to think of it that way. But I mean, on a positive note, there's still a ton of knowledge out there and new knowledge being created all the time. So Trinda Cody is a Indigenous youth. So she shared one of her stories or her pictures, showing us the impact that wildland fires can have on animals in the forest and that we need to respect fire as a living entity. Story 2 talks about revitalizing cultural burning in Zwiston, which is another community in BC. So there, they're looking to bring fire back on the landscape, and it discusses, some of the issues that they're encountering, especially with climate change and how to get fire back in a new world. And story 3 looks at the Wabaseemoong Type 1 firefighter training and fuel treatment program that they have in their nation. And so this is where they're, trying to get firefighters trained up to be able to do burning in their own community without, well, I guess in partnership with the Kenora Fire District there. Story 4 is a really cool program that's happening in Cumberland House, Saskatchewan, where they're basically burning to enhance muskrat habitat. And the really neat thing there is that they're doing it in partnership with their local school, where they have elders and fire knowledge holders go and work with the children, showing them how to burn. And they've produced a children's book from that project. So story number 4 in the booklet goes into great detail about that. Here's another image from Darren Matsuwagan. And so he is a wildland firefighter. And he's just showing here that that humans can work to prevent destructive forest fires from happening, prevent the bad fires we discuss a lot in the booklet. So story 5 and story 6, they go into 2 communities or 2 First Nation reserves that were evacuated from wildland fire. And so both of the evacuations were really stressful. They were very long, over 3 weeks. And I think in one community, they were out for almost 2 months and, had fire that directly impacted them. In story number 6, they talk about how they believe that their local firefighters saved their community from the fire, because that fire was happening at the same time that a much larger fire that was impacting a bigger urban center called Slave Lake was occurring. So the First Nation felt, that they were ignored and basically had to protect themselves from another fire that was occurring at the same time. And I think, the thing from this story that I want to bring up is that, we found that there was such high resiliency in the communities. They knew, which of their community members were at risk. where people should go, how people should be treated. And when a lot of the issues happened during the evacuations was when external agencies started getting involved who weren't as familiar with the local context. Sorry, so story 7 discusses Yukon First Nations wildfires. So this is a great group that's up in Yukon territory, and they're looking to get First Nations youth back learning about their culture, learning about fire, being employed in wildland firefighting. And they have a really neat resiliency program there where not only do they teach firefighting and cultural burning, but they also teach things like opening a bank account, managing money, all sorts of great things to the youth there. And it's been quite a successful program. Story 8 and 9, those look at specific communities in Saskatchewan and Peavine, which is in northern Alberta, looking at what those communities are doing to reduce fire risk centered around their culture. So for example, in Peavine, their community elders there are really important to them. So they actually have a program there where they have, it's like a community elder day, and where the community members go and do cleanup around elders' homes who aren't necessarily able to do it themselves every year to try and, reduce fuel load, but it's also a really great community building activity. And then they have a feast after. And so it's a really, nice idea of normalizing wildfire risk mitigation. So this art here is from Stacy Rosor, and she's looking at the fire saga. So it's a representation of wildland fire burning in the Golden Eagle. And so yeah, you can read the description there. Story 10, this is an Enterprise Northwest Territory. So we're moving way up to the north of Canada now. And so this is the Northwest Territory's first recognized fire smart community. So this community has a really high Indigenous population. And yeah, they've done great work up there at reducing their risk in an area that is very high risk to wildland fire every year. Story number 11, this looks at the Black Lake Indian Band fire in 2015, and you can see there that there was a fire guard that was put into place that basically protected the reserve from a fire, a very remote reserve, and that's often the difficulty with these fires in First Nation communities is some of them, don't have roads to them, so they're fly in or fly out to evacuate, or get in a boat and take your boat across the lake. And it really creates a lot of logistical issues, especially when there's smoke in the air and, people are panicking. So this details, what happened during that fire and basically how they were able to stop a very quick, fast approaching fire that was burning at really high intensity from entering their community. And as I mentioned before, there's no real way that we can, check boxes to make Indigenous communities fire smart. And so one of the things that we kind of came up with is, looking at all these different stories that were shared, what were kind of 10 overarching, 10, I think is the list, is 10 overarching themes that people could do on their, in their communities. And so this was targeted more at like community leadership level. And it really went into detail of, different programs that could be accessed or other things that they could do, like really, I think our group really wanted them to be quite practical recommendations that people could look and think like, okay, that one, are we doing it in our community? What can we do? And one was as simple as like, access this funding and then host a community meeting where, you lay out maps and get people to circle, their hunting grounds or other important berry picking areas, like important cultural areas to them, so that those can be included in any sort of risk planning during a fire. So another piece of art here from Daniel Harrington, and this is from the story The Raven That Stole the Sun. And so he gave a nice digital piece here to include in the booklet. Again, it's really small on my screen, so I can't read it to you. But yeah, he wanted to basically show how fire can be used for the raven and how the raven is given it to us as well. So again, another fire creation story from a different part of Canada. So I guess just to kind of start wrapping up here, there was, I don't want to lie, there was a lot of challenges in putting out this booklet. When I first wrote up the draft to produce this based on, what had come out of my PhD research, where I heard, that people didn't see themselves in any sort of risk reduction programs in Canada. That was in 2011. And so that was when we first put forward the proposal to various different funding sources. And, it was finally funded in 2019 by Fire Smart Canada in Alberta. So it was a long haul trying to, convince that there was a need for it. And then how much it costs too. It's not cheap because, as I said, like, the artists, we need to compensate fairly. Any knowledge holders that share stories, all those people, require adequate compensation. Another real difficulty that we had in Canada was we really needed to avoid a pan-Indigenous approach. So, it was that when we started this, it was going to be 8 pages was my, what I thought it would be. And it ended up being 50, because by the time we went through, everybody had something different to say, and people wanted their nation or their nation's stories represented in the book. And as I mentioned before, there's all sorts of different ceremonies and fire uses and reasons for burning. And what we kept trying to tell people was, we're trying to include as much as we can, but this is just the start. Hopefully down the road, we can maybe do some more regional specific pieces. But yeah, this was kind of the first one. So another big issue that we had was trying to get Eastern representation. So in Canada, most of our fires lately have actually been happening that impact, larger populations in the West. So in BC, Alberta, the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, and Saskatchewan too. And so we found that there was really high interest there for Indigenous people who wanted to be involved in the booklet, wanted to share their stories. Manitoba and Ontario, like, were interested, but a bit less so. And then as we went out east, like Quebec and then the Maritime provinces, there was very little interest to be, I guess, to share their stories for the booklet, or to, and even just, I think, a lack of being involved in the greater wildfire community in Canada. So maybe, they didn't even know about the booklet as much as, or this process as much as we tried to get it out to everyone that we could think of. The other big issue was, for me, I'm always concerned about intellectual property and protecting Indigenous knowledge systems. So we were worried a bit putting some of these things in the booklet that they might get co-opted. There's a really big issue with cultural burning, where agencies want to come and to learn from Indigenous people how to burn. And then because those agencies are in power, then they can go and put that fire on the landscape, where Indigenous people who taught how to burn, and those techniques aren't actually able to use fire in their own territory, because in terms of wildfire, they have not as much power in Canada, especially. I think it's maybe a little bit different in the States, but in Canada, our crown territory is really, our crown forest, I guess, is managed by the provinces, and it tends, wildfire management agencies there tend to be, the experts in burning, and anybody else is seen as, not having that expertise to burn on the landscape. And I should say too, I do understand, I guess this is getting into my next point too here, where it's aligning agency visions with Indigenous visions. So we had a hard time in the booklet with, like, what agencies wanted to see in the booklet compared to what Indigenous people wanted to see. So one example I'll give was, as I mentioned before, burning. Most Indigenous people, because of the type of burns that we do in very low risk conditions, most don't wear any sort of PPE, and they might, they wouldn't necessarily have like Wajax or anything, or like a piss pack or anything. They would just have a rake maybe. So we included pictures to show like the reality of fire in Indigenous communities. And it was, I think agencies and other folks were rightly so, maybe quite worried that other people would see those images and just think, that they didn't have to wear personal protective equipment, or, that they didn't need agency permission to burn. So it's really hard with Indigenous fire use and the agencies that we have now, because you can see how the agencies are concerned and want to protect human health and safety, but then, Indigenous people also have this inherent right to be responsible for the land. Sorry, here we go. Okay, so to purchase the booklet, you can follow this link here. I just put it in case anyone's interested. So Indigenous nations, organizations, or peoples can get free copies. We were lucky enough to get quite a substantial amount of funding from the Government of Manitoba Wildfire Management Agency, Kim Fiddler. Shout out to her to provide those copies. So international orders too need to go through the general@firesmartcanada.ca. But at this time, unfortunately, there's no PDF available. FireSmart Canada made that decision that it would just be a physical product at the moment. They wanted people to see the booklet and to really take in the art and, not see it on a computer screen. I don't know, honestly, what the plan is for that in the future, but yeah, we'll see how it goes. And I just thought too, since I don't think I've spoken to quite a few of the people on here. And so I just thought I'd maybe mention some of the other work that we're doing in Canada on this. So last year we released the Blueprint for Wildland Fire Science in Canada. And that was this kind of national collaborative effort that they worked with hundreds of different researchers and fire practitioners to develop kind of 6 themes in Canada that we needed to focus our fire research around. And theme 2 for that is Indigenous fire knowledge. And I think in Canada, it's really been recognized that there's this need to include and incorporate Indigenous peoples and their knowledge in the fire problem. Good Fire. So we have a podcast series out. It's called Good Fire, Stories of Indigenous Fire Stewardship. You can find it on any of the podcast platforms, and you'll have to excuse me on it because it was just, a kind of thing where it was me and colleagues and we were like, we should record our conversations. And then it was like, oh man, people are actually listening now. I was like, oh, I should have taken how to speak properly training on a podcast. But anyways, they're there. And I think that they're a really good information source for what different Indigenous communities are doing. And they go really in depth too. Each is about an hour and a half long. So really in-depth discussions about fire. We've got a bunch of programs with revitalizing cultural burning in Canada, which I mentioned before. Another big one that's coming up is in Canada, we have a lot of Indigenous firefighters. And one of the things that we're looking at is Indigenous firefighter cultural safety and how we can get more Indigenous people involved in fire, and not only in seasonal positions, but moving them into permanent employment. And I saw Marty Alexander's on the call here. He's on that project with me. So we're really excited about that moving forward. We also are working with the Department of Defense on improving the evacuations of remote communities in Canada. And that kind of links in to the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership. And so we have a book coming out on that partnership. And so we worked there in depth with 7 First Nations across Canada who had been evacuated. We looked at, we spoke with over 200 First Nation wildfire evacuees, and then looked at, what they encountered, what the evacuation was like, how they found out they had to be evacuated, what did they take with them, how they left their community, issues that were faced, good things that happened, what happened when they returned to their communities. And so this is kind of the book discussing all of that from the perspectives of the evacuees from the 7 First Nations. So that comes out, I think, this spring. And then there's a new program starting up looking at getting Indigenous fire guardians on the landscape in Canada. So people who are permanently employed in their communities to do fire suppression work and fire mitigation, fire prevention as a year-round employment opportunity. So just to give some key points, I think, we need to stop speaking about vulnerability. I think lots of times when I hear people talk about Indigenous people and fire, it's like, oh, they're so vulnerable to fire. And I think what we need to realize is that these are, marginalized communities that most that have been colonized have gone through, horrible things that have kind of tried to decimate their culture, and that there's really actually so much knowledge, especially around fire in these communities. And what I often hear too is people will say, oh, well, there's a lack of capacity in these communities to address any issues. But what there really is a lack of funded capacity. So, we wouldn't do the work for free in our communities. Like you can volunteer, but in many of these communities, there'll be like the fire chief who also is like a band counselor, who also is, the head of the hockey team, who also, he might have like 10 different hats that he wears in the community. So we really need, if we're getting serious about this, we really need to fund capacity in these communities, long-term sustainable funding. And yeah, the other thing just that I wanted to, if people are interested in getting into this topic, I just think the one thing I wanted to chat about was, really avoiding the terms of, capture Indigenous knowledge, gather Indigenous knowledge. I always hear those coming from agencies, but that knowledge is the communities. There's a lot of, as I said before, intellectual property rights around that knowledge. And so the thing is that's really important is funding those communities to do their own work. So to rebuild that resiliency that's inherent to them. And yeah, addressing institutional barriers that continue to keep the same communities vulnerable to disasters. We really need to look in the mirror, especially in Canada. Why are our Indigenous people always being impacted by wildfire? And there's reasons there. So I think that's it from me. This is just a piece of art by Karen Erickson, looking at, well, Musham, we call grandfather, and his granddaughter looking at, fire from afar, or smoke from a far away fire kind of coming up and turning the sky orange, the start of, that something might be coming. Yeah, so that's it from me, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or you can contact me by email as well. I think my email was on the first page.
Thank you, Amy. That was fantastic. This is a topic that I am personally very interested in, and I think this knowledge is so incredibly valuable, and it is very sad that some of it is being lost just to time, and the fact that that the people are, not able to practice it, and it's a real shame. I will say I really enjoyed your picture of you out burning with your dog. I am impressed that he was so calmly sitting. He or she was just so calmly sitting there, because mine would have been as far away as possible.
Yeah, what I did not show in that picture though is my daughter. We have like a side-by-side, we call them in Canada, like, an off-road vehicle.
Mhm.
And my daughter was in there with the covers over her head because she hates the smell of smoke. So, we're working on her.
Gotcha. Gotta break her at that. But
yeah.
that's awesome. I'm waiting for some questions to pop up in here. Marty said, "Well done, Amy." So he proved.
Yeah, thanks, Marty.
Well, while we're waiting for questions here too, I will also, since this is the LOF&BE group is hosted by IFSS, the next IFSS symposium that's going to be virtual. Tara McGee is actually one of the plenary speakers, and I noticed that she was co-author on that book about that evacuation work. So that'll be really interesting to get more of the IFSS community kind of more aware of all of the stuff that you guys are doing. So
yeah,
awesome.
Great. I'm sure that she'll probably be speaking about that research there in depth, I'm guessing. Yeah,
I believe she is. I remember reading her paper on it, and yeah, it's ringing a lot of bells here. So
yeah.
Okay, question here. So we've got one that says, are there any roles for Indigenous women for your communities that you can share with us?
Hey, Ness.
Ah,
So I think that's my buddy Vanessa from Australia. So, so yeah, I think, I know we've talked about it a bit before, but it's funny, like, I think historically, and, from talking to my elders, there were roles for Indigenous women in fire, especially when you go to communities. Lots of the elders will say, that especially because lots of it was around berries, burning for berries in Canada. And so because, mostly women were berry pickers in most of those communities, they were the ones, who would see and assess, and they knew that, they needed to burn a certain berry patch. So the one woman told me in Shack and Indian Band, like, oh, the men think that they're the burners, but we're really the ones who just tell them to go and where to burn. So they're like, we're actually the heads. They're like the lackeys that like, just kind of do what we want. So I think, but I would say that it's become a much more male dominated field in Canada in terms of Indigenous fire. Mostly now, most of the involvement in fire management in Canada is through fire suppression. And in like the 70s and 80s, a lot of Indigenous women were really involved in that too. But it's slowly Indigenous women have gotten less and less involved, unfortunately. So, I attended the Fire Sticks Alliance conference they had. It was virtual as well. I think it was right before Christmas. And there they had this amazing panel of Vanessa and I should say, sorry, Vanessa Kavanaugh, for those who don't know her, and a bunch of other, incredibly powerful Indigenous women who use fire all the time on the landscape. And I mean, we just don't have that in Canada. And like I said before, there might be women that burn, obviously, that I'm not aware of, but I would say definitely, the people at the forefront of Indigenous burning, it's mostly men.
Question from Marty here. Did Indigenous peoples in Canada deliberately burn around their communities to mitigate against high intensity wildfires in the past?
Yeah, I would say just based on like what I know from the elders that I've worked with, and then from Henry Lewis's work, and I'm sure Marty, you've read a lot of it too, is that yes, they did all the time burn for that. But an interesting thing to me is that, prescribed burning now that agencies do, generally their primary objective is fuel reduction. But for Indigenous communities, that was generally like, the third or fourth objective that was achieved. So they would be burning for other reasons. And one of the biggest ones actually was to produce firewood, like easy access to firewood around their communities. And then, it was just very helpful that it also reduced the fire risk to their communities. So, and it depends too, like some Cree people, what they used to do was they would have like their summer and winter camp. So like their summer camp on the prairie, like my family, where they would do their buffalo hunting and gathering for the winter, and then they would winter in the bush. So lots of times what would happen was when they left either camp, they would just burn it, because then when they returned, 6 months later, they would be returning to kind of a totally cleaned up landscape. And again, with reduced fire risk. So in the summer, like, they would burn the prairie in the fall when they left, and when they came back in the spring, there was beautiful, fresh green grass and stuff there. So depends on the nation. But yeah, everyone that I've worked with or that spoke to, they definitely would do that. And that's one thing that I really see different with agency burning, is that I would say Indigenous people are not scared to burn around houses. Like, they have no problem going up and burning right beside their house. And even me, like, I burn all the time. We burn right around our house, and we actually do it for mouse, for rodent control. So you don't get, that really pillowy dead grass that the mice love to live in. So yeah, it really depends why people burn, but I would say that's definitely a plus to Indigenous burning.
And Marty points out fuel wood production was how they got to burn the North Province for the ICFME project in 97 to 2001. So that's a interesting connection there.
Yeah.
Erica asks, well, she says, thank you for the presentation. Then she asks, when will the evacuation book be published and where is the best place to get it other than Amazon?
Yeah. So I think it's coming out in the spring, Erica, with UBC Press is the publisher. And so I'm not sure, when their spring launch date is. And I know I have seen it on Amazon. I think you can buy it directly from UBC Press if you don't want to support Jeff Bezos. But yeah, I'm trying to think. I haven't really seen. I know that there are Indigenous owned bookstores that may be able to order it for you if you wanted to support that. And I do actually have a list of Indigenous owned bookstores that are online. So I can reach out to you on Twitter and share that list with you if you're interested.
She would love to see that list. I think that would be great.
Yeah, I would say too, just one really cool thing about that is the book proceeds are actually going to that Yukon First Nation wildfire group. So yeah, as a public servant, unfortunately, I can't accept book royalties, which sucks. But so anyways, the money's going to them, which I think will be great. It'll be contributing to their resilience program for Indigenous youth.
That's awesome. On a related note, are any of the proceeds from the Blazing the Trail book going back to the Indigenous groups that contributed, or they got their funds ahead of time? I don't know.
Yeah, so we did do honorariums for everyone before through the funding from Alberta. That booklet actually, we're just covering printing costs on it. They're basically losing money on it, so a little bit of money, but it's basically just covering printing and shipping, because I think it's $10 a book, and that includes your shipping costs. And then if you I think if you order 8 or more booklets, it's only $5 a book. So that one's bare minimum.
Not a lot extra left.
I should have, though, made it more expensive. That would have been smart.
That artwork is incredible. So, I mean, yeah, well worth the money to buy that artwork. So cool.
Yeah, and it's actually beautiful. I have it here. It's really high glossy and
wow. Yeah. Super high quality print there.
Yeah. So it is a really nice booklet. They went with a really good printer. So
nice. Comment here to thank you for such a beautiful presentation and excited to learn more. She was from Norway, so we do have somebody from Europe make it. Yay, thank you so much for staying up. So
I've actually heard too about some Indigenous burning practices in Norway. I was reading about it on Twitter. I think someone was sharing it, which was pretty cool.
Wow. Yeah, that's something I think I've been recently introduced to the idea that there are pockets of Indigenous culture within Europe that are still practicing some of these things. Like there's, I guess, a group in Spain that has some ties to the Indigenous burning and stuff. So we typically don't think of that kind of thing still being in Europe. So it's interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, really cool.
Questions? To go back through my notes here, because I'm sure I had others. Nobody else asks. Okay, maybe I'll ask mine. So, I mean, you mentioned that it's hard to get the objectives of burning to match between agencies and the Indigenous cultures. And, I guess it's probably a little bit different everywhere, but I mean, what is that process like? Like when you go and you want to burn, what happens? I assume you have to get some kind of permit, and can you maybe explain that a little bit more about what are the possibilities of getting those things to align, how we can possibly do more of that kind of thing, and what your experience is there?
Yeah, so in Canada, again, it depends where you are. Some places are it's easier to burn, and also it depends how remote you are. So basically, if you're far away from the wildfire agencies, you can burn whatever, really. But like I know for me on private land, I can burn when I want, as long as there's not a burn ban in place. And I live in a different, I live in in a county that's more agriculture, so it's a little bit different. But that's the real complication of it, is it's really confusing. So Indigenous people that live on reserve can burn where they want, but they're supposed to notify the Welfare Management Agency. But Indigenous, like our communities aren't just the reserves, right? Like the reserves are basically just what the government gave to First Nations people. It's much larger territory. So to be able to burn in your territory, you have to have agency permission. And the big frustration with that is that it's very, the processes are very difficult to get approval. There's multiple steps, and then also most of the time you need Western knowledge, I guess I'll just say, so you need to know like what the fire weather index might be that day. You need to know the like the fuels that you're working with in the classification system and the Canadian fire danger rating. So there's all these pressures, I guess, that and you need GIS and all these other things to kind of map out your burns, which for lots of Indigenous communities, like you just want to go out and burn. And for me too, like, and the elders I talked to, like the one guy was telling me about how he'll burn depending on how plump the spruce needles are on this tree outside of his house, because then he knows that it's like that the moisture content is good enough, but he's not measuring it in any sort of Western scientific way, but it's his own observation way to know the conditions are safe to burn. But you can't go and say like, okay, well on March 18th I'm going to conduct a burn on my property. It's, you have to kind of be, and I think that's the beauty of Indigenous burning, is that it's so localized and it involves a lot of people being able to burn and have power, right? So it's not just one agency with one person managing an entire region. It's lots of individual people who work together to achieve objectives. So it's not one person's responsibility for everything. And in Canada, I think that's been a big issue we've had, and we've actually, I think the agencies know it's a problem and are trying to work on what solutions can we have. And their biggest thing is that they need to know where the fires are happening, because people might call them in and they don't want to have to resource or send crews that aren't needed, those type of issues. So one solution that they were talking about was having the prescribed burn plan for like the agency and people, and then having like a cultural burn plan for the cultural burns that are done in different lower risk seasons, and then having those be like a much easier format to fill out that are based more on Indigenous knowledge. Again, not sure like where that's going to go or how that's going to go, because then you get into other people that use fires, so farmers, ranchers, and then it's, why are these communities getting special treatment? So it's it's a bit of a powder cake, I guess, like to burn. But I know lots of Indigenous nations I've heard that have conflict in their areas with the welfare management agencies, they just will burn and say, charge us then. And they've never been charged, because I think the issue is that almost everyone's afraid of it going to court, and having some type of higher level decision on who's the expert on burning, and who owns the land.
Well, yeah, I guess there's no easy answer for that.
Yeah, so it's super complicated.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. But I think like the really good things that I've seen happen in Canada, and same with like in Australia and in California, is where the Indigenous nations develop really good relations with like the local agency people, and then kind of team up to do to kind of work together to just get fire on the ground however they can. Generally, we want it to be Indigenous led, but I think we need agency folks there to support us.
Yeah. Well, gosh, especially when lawsuits might be on the table.
Mhm.
Oh, that's a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting stuff. I haven't seen any other questions pop up. I mean, we have a couple minutes left if anybody else has any last minute questions here. Sam, it's a very nice talk. We will report, we will prepare a report if you're okay on the slides. So
Perfect.
not only will this be recorded, but it looks like Sam wants to make sure that this gets out as widely
Perfect.
as
So
possible.
Sarah, I sent you the PDF, I think. So yeah, you can feel free to share that or whatever.
Great, perfect. Marty just chimed in as to ask what's next.
Yeah, well, our survey, Marty, on Indigenous firefighters. Just kidding. That's actually coming out hopefully next month. But the, I think next is just we're hoping to start in Canada an Indigenous fire working group at a national level. And that would be, I think, similar to, what they've done in Australia with the Fire Sticks program and other groups, where I think the issue that we're having in Canada right now is that, nations want to burn, but individually, it's just such a struggle. So I think that there's going to be like a more of a collective movement for, how can we all work together, and influence policy at a national level to get fire in Indigenous territories in the right way. So yeah, I think that that's what's next, Marty. But again, it's complicated. Like, do we have the right people on the working group? Are we representing everybody that we need to? It's difficult, but I think, we're slowly getting there.
Well, that's awesome. I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our time. So thank you again, Amy. That was an awesome talk. Just a quick little advertisement for next month's talk. It will be February 8th. So there's a slight date change. It's one day earlier than we originally had planned, so we can avoid some conflicts. Same time, same place. We'll send out an email registration. I am the speaker the next time. So I'll be getting kind of a little overview of kind of the research that I do and tying it into some of the wildfires that we experienced in the West last summer. So yeah, we'll see you all then. Thanks again, Amy. It was awesome.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks everyone for coming. See you.